Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Satisfied Watch Collector podcast. My name is James, and today we're going to be talking about 5 of the best finished watches out there in the luxury watch space. And some of these may not be what you would expect. So I picked watches from my personal favorite brands. You're probably familiar with some of them. So we'll talk through each one. I'll give you some specs on them, and then we'll talk about what makes the movement finishing on these watches so over the top. Now, I'm James. I'm a watch collector, enthusiast, and advisor, and I've been collecting for almost a decade now, and the goal of my channel is for you to know and love your watches. So please like the video if you enjoy this type of content, and subscribe if you want to get new videos every week. Now, with that, let's do a quick wrist check. Today, I am wearing my Omega Seamaster Ploprof 1200 meter on a blue rubber strap, and it's kind of becoming my go-to casual weekend watch for just about everything, which is I'm really enjoying it. So with that, let's jump into the topic. Now again, today we're covering 5 of the most impressively finished watches on the market, and some of these we're going to have multiple variants of, some it's just a single watch. So we're going to jump right in here with Jaeger-LeCoultre and the Duometre. Now the Duometre is an interesting concept for a watch. It was introduced originally in 2007. If you've not seen my channel, JLC is one of my absolute favorite brands, and they just have so much to offer in their catalog. So the Duometre in particular has a couple of really interesting features. Now this is an example where the complications have changed over time with this watch, and you can find some different variations out there. So as you look through the back catalog of the Duometre, you may see some different stuff, which I think is actually really interesting, because then if you have a particular complication that you like, you can probably find a Duometre that has that complication, and I really appreciate that. So the idea behind the Duometre is super interesting. So the idea is I have 2 separate barrels, one barrel for just the timekeeping function, and then one barrel for all of the complications, whether it's a moon phase or a chronograph or a date or whatever else I'm doing. And the idea there, given that I have 2 different power sources, is I don't lose any power when I'm using the complications. So not only do I have 2 barrels in the watch, but I also have 2 separate gear trains in the watch that are connected together kind of at the escapement essentially. And so the idea again being that if I start my chronograph, there's very frequently a chronograph on the Duometre. If I start my chronograph, I don't lose any balance amplitude. I don't lose any of the energy that's impulsing the balance, so that my timekeeping is really, really steady and consistent, and there's not a drop in timekeeping when I start or stop my chronograph mechanism. So that's kind of the general idea, and the fact that Jaeger-LeCoultre was able to put this together in a movement that's as small as something that will fit on your wrist is just an absolute feat of engineering. There are others out there now that have done similar types of things, where you're basically having 2 different, either like with Vacheron, for instance, in the chronometre resonance, there's actually 2 separate balance wheels, so I mean there are some different examples of where watchmakers have done these types of things, but there's not many, and JLC has, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful and functional, because of the fact that it's all about accurate timekeeping. Now, the variant that we are going to look at today is specifically from 2014, because there have been a lot of different varieties out there. There's a new one in blue that I think is really great. There's some other variants that are really awesome, but the one that I thought was the most interesting that I want to look at is a 200-piece limited edition from 2014, and it was made in a white gold case, and it has a Gronefeld enamel white dial. Now, JLC is known for their watchmaking prowess. I've talked often about my JLC Master Ultra Thin Perpetual enamel, so there are definitely other watches, other examples where they've done these really interesting dials, whether it's guilloche or enamel, things like that. But on this particular Duometre, they did that. They did a white enamel dial, and it's so striking because this watch also has a moon phase on it, and the background to the moon phase is blue. So you have this like really, really vibrant white dial that's got this kind of like shimmering element to it because of what enamel is, right? It's a glass-based paint that they essentially layer onto the dial, and then they heat it so that it adheres to the dial base. And so when you have this really vibrant white and then you have this blue that's the background on the moon phase of this watch, I just think it looks really, really cool. It's clean. It's a very busy dial because of what the Duometre is, but you have that nice contrast between that bright white, that little pop of blue with the color, and then they also had some red accents to this as well. So at the top of some of their indicators, you'll see it on even modern day JLCs now where they have, like, so for instance, the date, if it's a pointer date, the 31 will be in red. So you can always find like the top of the, the date wheel, if you will, or the date layout. So it's very visible for you. So that's the watch that we're talking about to start. Now, what makes it so interesting? Well, like I say, the enamel dial, it's white gold, 200 piece limited edition. The case size is about 40.5 millimeters, which is fairly wearable. The lug to lug is like 49. So in terms of being able to wear this watch, it is a fairly wearable watch. Like it's very reasonable for most wrists, which is one of the reasons that I do like it. So other things that you have, in addition to the enamel dial, we're talking about finishing today, right? So let's look at the actual finishing of this watch, which is pretty spectacular. So basically, to start with, you have this German silver that they use for their bridges. Now, this has changed over time. They've changed what they've made these movements with over time. So they used to use this German silver, which is the case for this watch, which again was released in 2014. And then more modern watch movements, they've changed actually to just use either steel or rhodium plated steel. So there are some variants now in the materials. But this one in particular, again, was when they were doing German silver, and basically it has a decent amount of copper in it. So it has this a little bit of a warmer tone than like a stainless steel or like a white gold. And that's one of the things that kind of has, some warmth, I guess, to the movement when you're looking at it. So overall, again, you have these two barrels at the top. Again, one is for the timekeeping, one is for the complications, and there's so much going on this movement. You have, first is the actual pattern that you can see, and so Côte de Genève is a type of finishing where you have stripes that are typically going in one direction, so it'll be like vertical stripes, something along those lines. With this Jaeger-LeCoultre in particular, they use something called Côte de Soleil, and so it almost is like a radial Côte de Genève, and I like how JLC does this because they basically take the balance wheel and the center point on the balance wheel, that acts as like, kind of the source of these sun rays that are coming out, Côte de Soleil. And so everything is kind of radiating out from under an imaginary point under, like, at the center of the balance wheel. And I always think it looks really cool based on how they do it, just because of how much space there is in between the bridges, but yet they still maintain a very like clean and consistent design. So I think that's one element that just makes it impressive right away. If you ever get the chance to look at a Duometre in person, flip the thing over and look at the movement, because that's actually one of the coolest elements of it. Other things that you'll notice a lot here, JLC does often do fired blued screws. So again, these are not colored screws, they're actually fired. So you take a steel screw and you fire it with a kiln, and over time it oxidizes and it changes the color until it's almost a navy blue color. It has a very, very nice look to it. It just adds a little bit of contrast, so it's not all one color on the back. Other things that it has, you'll find the beveling, the anglage is really impressive here. Some movements I've even talked about, like again, my Master Ultra Thin Perpetual Enamel, like the beveling is very minimal and it's not really that noticeable. I mean, if you look at it with a loupe, obviously you can see it, but I really appreciate about the Duometre is like the JLC goes all out with the finishing on this movement. So like if you really want to see what JLC is capable of from a movement perspective, not just like a dial or a complication perspective, the Duometre is a great one to look at because of that. You have your jewel sinks in there that are, that have chamfered slotting on them. So you have a nice little like beveled cut in the bridges themselves. Same thing with the screws, chamfered around the edges of the screws. And then just the architecture, you can literally kind of see the flow from the barrels to the escapement and the balance wheel. So it's just a really beautiful setup. It's very deep. There's a lot of depth to it. Looking at an image straight on versus looking at an image from a little bit of an angle, you can really see the depth that they use in these movements. And then as with a lot of JLC movements, there's usually perlage on the base plate, which is just laid down kind of underneath. Now, the crazy part is you actually don't see a lot of that because it's covered up by all the bridges, the gear train, the barrels, all that stuff, but you can still see it like when you get to the area where the balance wheel is because it's more open. You can see that perlage laid down on the base plate as well. So overall, JLC with the Duometre, really impressive and such a fantastic example of movement finishing. One of my favorite brands, and I would highly recommend, again, if you've never seen one of these in person, you should definitely go check out a Duometre in person at your local JLC boutique or whatever. It's absolutely a watch that you could wear upside down because the movement is just so impressive. And of course, the complications, I haven't even really talked about some of those, but they've done everything from just a plain chronograph to adding, like I say, the moon phase with this one. And there's power reserve indicators, for both barrels on the dial. It also has a foudroyant, so it's a 1/6 of a second on there. And then, let's see, what else? I mean, now they've worked their way up to having like the Sphero Tourbillon and the Helio Tourbillon, and they've made them all in a Duometre style design. So definitely a lot of watchmaking prowess at JLC and worth your time to take a look at. Now let's move on to our second watch that we're going to look at today, and that is the Vacheron Constantin Traditionnelle Tourbillon, the one released in 2023 with a green dial and matching strap. Now, Vacheron is another one of my favorite watch brands for a lot of reasons. They have the history there. They're actually, I think, the longest standing operating watch manufacturer. So that by itself is impressive. I think it was 1755 when they actually first started. So they've been making watches for literally, we're coming up on 300 years, which is just incredible. So that's pretty impressive. And I guess technically they were more so assembling watches, and now they have, their own in-house calibers. So, but overall, Vacheron has a lot of heritage and history behind it. They do have a really lovely design language. I mean, when I think about the watches that are out there in the space, JLC is one of my favorites. Vacheron is one of my favorites, obviously. My collection has Grand Seiko, Girard-Perregaux. But from a design language, I do think they create a lot of really clean-looking dials, aesthetics, and that is absolutely the case with this Traditionnelle tourbillon. So what is a tourbillon? I mean, to start with, essentially it was made to cancel out the effects of gravity in early timekeeping, mostly in like pocket watch days, and now they've kind of migrated their way into wristwatches. And some folks would say, okay, well, if you have a flat tourbillon, that will cancel out gravity in some positions of the watch. So the best and most ideal way to do this would be to have some sort of a rotating or cylindrical tourbillon. And that's, like I was mentioning before with JLC, that's what they've done with the Sphero and the Helio tourbillon, is they made it on multiple axes. So it's constantly rotating in different planes, if you will. So it's not just flat in line with the watch. But nevertheless, that doesn't make it any less beautiful when you're looking at an example of something like this with the Vacheron Traditionnelle. So this watch was, again, made with a green dial and a matching green strap. The dial itself has this really nice, like, sunray kind of graining to it. And it's a radial sunray, so it looks great, kind of, again, out from the cannon pinion at the center of the watch. This one is platinum. It's a 41 millimeter case and about 48 millimeters lug to lug. So kind of a similar wearing experience to the JLC, a little bit thinner, but overall still a really beautiful watch. And the most impressive thing to me about some of these watches is just the bridge for the tourbillon alone can take anywhere from like 5 to 15 hours just to like actually, some of them are very rounded and they'll black polish this. So, you know, that little bridge that you're seeing that covers the tourbillon and goes across the tourbillon cage horizontally can take like 10 hours hand finishing just to actually black polish it and make it the shape that they want and make it absolute perfection. Now, in this case, you have the Maltese cross of Vacheron, not only on the dial as a applied marker, but it's also on the tourbillon cage, which I think is a really neat little detail. And then the screws are different colors. So there's one screw that's darker that indicates kind of like that's where your seconds are. And you can follow it around the tourbillon cage, showing that it's making its way across a minute. It does have a little minute track on the outside of the watch, so you can kind of see that, a little railroad track. And then the indices are faceted beautifully, Dauphine style hands, just a really, really beautiful design. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about movement finishing. So let's flip over this watch and take a look at the back of it, which is absolutely beautiful. And there's so many different things that we could talk about. But one of my favorites that I really like is that Vacheron works in these perpetual rotors. So, whereas something like the JLC is going to be a manual wind watch, then you come over here to Vacheron Constantin and you have an automatic tourbillon, because of the fact that they can still find a way to make the movement narrow enough that in the case you've got a little bit of space around the outside of the bridges where you can put this peripheral rotor and then connect it to the winding system so that you don't have to worry about manually winding your watch. So that's one of my favorite things about just the way that these movements are constructed with Vacheron and Constantin. But that's not really movement finishing, that's more just construction. So let's look at the finishing. So you have Côte de Genève, like I was mentioning before, so you have these stripes that are going across the back side of the bridges in one direction, basically just straight from top to bottom. You have, again, chamfered slots around all the screws. You can kind of see that. The screw is not tight up against the bridge. There's a little bit of a gap. And the actual screw where the screwdriver would go, they call it chamfered slotting. It actually has a little bit of a taper to it just so that your screwdriver fits in there properly when you're going to service the watch. So those are a couple of elements. In addition, you have, again, the jewel sinks that look very nice, where you can see the pivot points on the different parts of the gear train. And then on the space in between the bridges, you have really lovely done beveling. And Vacheron movements are generally very, very good with their beveling. You can always see them. They're noticeable. It really just adds a nice visible element to the watch. And especially at the bottom there on the back of the tourbillon cage, you can see those big cutouts, so that you can see right through it where the tourbillon is. And they also have beveling going on down there. So just a really, really nice, really beautifully done tourbillon from Vacheron. And the other thing that you're seeing here for the first time, and we haven't talked about yet, is the Geneva seal that you'll see on both the case as well as the movement with Vacheron, and it's on another brand we'll talk about later. Basically, the Geneva seal, there are two things that are required to attain this seal. One is where the watch or case or movement or whatever it is actually made. So it has to be made in the area of Geneva, right around Geneva. So that's part of it. So it kind of limits who can actually achieve this, because you have to be making your watches there. Otherwise you can't acquire the Geneva seal. So that's part of it. The other part is the movement construction and finishing. And a lot of this is done by hand at this level of watchmaking. So there's certain construction elements that are required. There's certain finishing elements that are required. Vacheron, again, being one of the finest, has no problem meeting that. It is just something that has been in their DNA for a long time. So that's why you'll often see on many of Vacheron's watches and movements, you'll see that Geneva seal both on the case and on the movement as well. So again, just a really great colorful dial here from Vacheron, and something that I think is worth taking a look at. Obviously, we're talking about higher price points as you start to get into some of this stuff, but you got to have some dreams. You got to have some places to start, some things to look at, and this is a fantastic example from Vacheron. Okay, so with that, let's move on to our third piece today that we are going to talk about, and that is we're going to go over to German watchmaking for a second, and we're going to talk about a Lange und Sohne, and specifically the little Lange 1 moon phase, sometimes called gold flux. And basically, this has a really stunning Aventurine dial with a moon phase on it. I had the chance to see this watch actually in person when I was on a trip in California and was able to go to a 1916 boutique and take a look at this thing, and it is absolutely stunning. Now, unlike the other ones that we've looked at so far, this is a little bit more of a wearable watch. So this one is a 37 millimeter case. Some people kind of think this is actually like a lady's watch. I don't think so at all. I mean, especially as smaller dial and case sizes are starting to become a little more popular again. I think this is absolutely a great unisex option for sure, and I think it would wear just fine on most wrists. So it's 37 millimeters in case diameter and about 44 millimeters lug to lug. So again, really easy to wear. For me, it would be about the same wearing experience as my Girard-Perregaux, but even that is a 41 millimeter case. This is a 37, so definitely a little bit more of a compact design here. Now, Aventurine, if you've not seen Aventurine, it is spectacular. There are many variants of it out there, and typically Aventurine is made in the similar form to how I described enameling with the JLC. So basically you have this glass-based paint, you layer it over the dial, and then you heat it and apply it to the dial base, and you heat it multiple times. You may create multiple layers, and that is very important with Aventurine, because in typical enameling, it's just that glass-based paint, and that's all that's in there. With Aventurine, now you have little fragments of typically copper and cobalt that are just scattered throughout the different layers of the enamel as you do this, so that then when you heat it and bake it and the dial is completely done, you get this real incredible depth and just an absolute fire to it whenever you see it under different lights, especially if you see Aventurine in the sun. It's a really amazing experience. I would highly recommend. If you haven't checked out an Aventurine dial in person, definitely worth your time. So other things you have going on here, you've got a big date, you've got a moon phase, you have a power reserve here on the right, and then this nice little numerical time dial with Roman numerals, at the 12, 3, 6, and 9, and then actual stars representing the other hours in there. So just a beautiful piece by Lange with a matching lovely strap. But again, we're talking about movement finishing today. So let's look at the back of this watch. And this is going to be a little bit different than the two we've seen so far. This is your typical Lange finishing. Now, the Côte de Genève on Lange are probably some of the best out there because of the depth that you can often see. And even in some of the stock photos that you can find out there online of the backs of their movements, when you see Côte de Genève generally on Lange, you'll often see just how much the shading and the light is noticeable in the different stripes across the back of the movement. And generally, the more shading that you see as you move it around, that means the deeper those stripes are. And these are really, really high quality stripes. So Côte de Genève, just absolutely knocking it out of the park. You can see that the jewels here are surrounded by chaton cups, and they're made of gold, which is just a beautiful little detail, and blue fired screws, as we were looking at with the JLC. So just really, really cool layout, kind of a nice element of consistency across, where you have that. And then the only part that's cut away in the bridge is to the side by the actual crown, the winding side, because that's where you have the balance. And the balance bridge is another piece of what we have to talk about with Lange, because Lange actually hand engraves every single balance bridge on the watches that have that feature, which is a lot of them. So even though, you're getting a series production watch, technically you're getting a, kind of piece unique in a way, because those balance bridges are all engraved by hand and they're beautifully done. And you've got, not only the ruby over the center of the balance wheel, but you also have that blue fired screw at the other end of the balance bridge, and then just a really nice visual display. You can see the escapement underneath. It just has a really, really beautiful look to it. And like I say, this is consistent across quite a few Lange models where they're obviously manual wind. There's no rotor to block the way, but it's just a beautiful, beautiful piece. So if you like white gold, you're kind of seeing that there's a theme here of white gold, and that's just, I like white metals. They obviously make many of these watches in rose or yellow, but today we're talking about a lot of white gold. All right, so with that, let's move on to our next watch, so number 4, and this one is going to be the Patek Phillipe Calatrava 5396G. So this is the annual calendar moon phase in blue, and it has the baguette hour markers. Now, normally I am not a fan of diamonds on a dial or on a watch in general. I think it just looks a little too blingy personally. This is an exception to that because I think it's very tastefully done and it's not over the top to the point where I think some of the early times when I actually saw this watch, I didn't actually even realize that they were diamond baguettes. I thought they were just kind of like applied indices like you would see on a lot of watches, and they're actually diamond baguettes. So 5396G, kind of a really interesting piece. I love the symmetry. It was originally launched back in 2006, was the first version of this, and it was actually to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the annual calendar, which Patek invented. So there's a little bit of a historical tie to it as well. Obviously, the Calatrava itself has been around for a long time, since 1932, so this was kind of one of the original dress watches out there on the market, which is why it has such a strong design language, and that's very recognizable in the luxury watch space now. So 2006 was the original launch. Then in 2016, to celebrate 20 years of the annual calendar, that was when they Patek released updated versions of this watch. So, and they've continued to release a couple of updates to it. Just the movement, with their latest technologies and things like that. This one, again, is going to be a white gold case. It's 38.5 millimeters in diameter and 47 millimeters lug to lug. So, again, a little around the same size as some of the prior ones we've looked at, with the Lange being the exception, being much, much smaller. The dial on this watch is stunning. They have just this really beautiful, like, sunburst gradient dial, where you have more blue as you get closer to the center, and then as you get further to the outside of the dial, you get more black. I really, really like this. It's kind of almost like what Moser does a little bit with their, funky fume dials. So really, really beautiful there. And then the other thing that I appreciate about this is it's got an annual calendar, so you have a nice complication. It's again, tastefully done where it's kind of right in the center, so you can see it right at the top. You can see the day, you can see the month, and then down at the bottom in the moon phase, actually, you can see the date right at the bottom, which I thought was a nice way to not make it super obvious or super like out there. It's just kind of blends right in with the the moon phase down at the bottom of the dial. So I do think that that's a really nice way of setting up the complication. And the dial is very harmonious. I've talked about this before. Dial harmony is like one of my most important things. Every now and then I may like watches that don't do it, but for me, this is one of the reasons that I'm not a huge fan of a lot of Pateks, but this one actually really appealed to me because of those reasons. So let's take a look at the movement, because again, we're talking about movement finishing today, and you can't really truly have a conversation about movement finishing without talking about Patek. They are just one of the best in the business. They've been doing it for such a long time. It's all done by hand, and it's beautiful, and it's lovely, and you've got the Côte de Genève again, across the bridges. This one is an automatic, so you've got that 22 karat rotor with the Calatrava cross just engraved right on it, which is beautiful. There's even some circular graining around the center of the rotor, which is a really nice little detail. Perlage on the base plate. Even the barrel, you can see is gold down underneath here, and then you've got, again, some of the same elements we've talked about, chamfered slots in the screws. You've got the Geneva seal on the movement. So, like, I know I'm not maybe talking as much about this Patek here in the finishing because we have talked a lot about some of the other elements already, but from a quality standpoint, Patek continues to be one of the players that is just, they're always on it. Like, their movement finishing is always top notch, and it's one of the reasons why they're as widely recognized for their watchmaking as they are, because Patek is just, they're one of the OGs. Like, they just do such a great job of beautifully finishing watches, even though very often I'm not a huge fan of some of Patek's design language, but this one was one that I had to pick and include in the conversation because of the brand. So, all right, let's go on to our last one, number 5, and we've moved around some of these geographies now, but we've got to go to Japan for this one because we're going to talk about the Credor H2 or the GBLT 997. It's the blue dial variant. They have a couple different variants of this, and this is platinum once again. This was originally released in 2021 from the Micro Artist Studio, and it's called the Ruri dial. The Micro Artist Studio being kind of the highest end of the Seiko empire of watchmaking. It's just unbelievable what they do with these watches. I had the opportunity a couple of years back to go to a Grand Seiko event, and they had a bunch of Grand Seikos. They also had a few Credors. Unfortunately, they did not have this one, but they did have the white dial variant of this, and they had a couple of the other, rose gold versions, I think, of it. And so this dial is just stunning in so many ways. So platinum, 39 millimeter case, 45 millimeters lug to lug, so much more wearable again, kind of around the same wearability as the Lange, just a little bit of a bigger dial. This dial is porcelain, and it's hand painted, the entire thing. And that's not just the base of the dial. That's everything on the dial is done by hand. That includes the hour markers, and that also includes the Credor name on the dial is done by hand. So, and if you look from dial to dial, it's not like you would ever really have a room of 10 of these in a room or something, but you would, if you probably looked under a loupe, may notice some slight variation in the way that these are crafted because they're done by hand. Low level of detail, though, and consistency is still pretty incredible, so you can't really fault them too much for that. So basically the way that they make this dial is, again, it's porcelain, and then what they do is they paint kind of like a lacquer over the top, and they make many, many, many layers of it. But then what they do is they use less layering both in the center under the cannon pinion or right around the cannon pinion, and they use less around the outside of the dial. And it creates, I'll find a picture of it like in the wild somewhere and like put it up here. It creates this incredibly cool like halo effect around the outside of the dial. And you have these real neat, like really precise looking syringe style hands, and then the second hand has the little moon on the counter as the counterweight on it. So just an unbelievable construction, even just from the front. So that's just, we'll just like pause for a second to leave that there. And then when you go to the back, there's just even more incredible stuff on the back. So when you look at the back of this, it kind of looks funky, and that is how a lot of spring drive watches will look. So again, if you're not familiar with spring drive, essentially what it does is it takes the best of both mechanical watchmaking and quartz, and it combines them together into a single movement. So you have essentially a mechanical governing wheel and gear train, and the governing wheel is spinning always in one direction, which is why you have that smooth sweep of the seconds hand. And then you have a quartz oscillator in there that is actually helping regulate the timing of the movement. So like just absolutely incredible technology to start. So this is a special version of that type of technology. It's a 7R14A movement that's only used in some of these very, very high-end pieces. The other thing that you'll find, obviously, blue-fired screws. You'll find the jewels in there as well. And then the beveling on here is just incredible. So leave it to Seiko, Grand Seiko, Credor, to come up with like just little ways to make a nod to the nature and the landscapes around where they make these watches. So the bellflower is one of the flowers that grows around many of the areas of these studios, right? So what they did was not only do they have the little emblem of the bellflower engraved on the bridge, but they also basically cut out or skeletonized the barrel of the movement with the bellflower. So when you look at the barrel, you can see 3 bellflowers next to each other, and you can see the mainspring, wound up inside the barrel. So another really cool detail there. Then if you look at the beveling around starting up at the barrel, and then as you work your way, there's this little kind of, curvature, almost like a line drawn down towards if you're looking at the movement, it would be kind of down to the right from where the barrel is. And what they actually did was they beveled the stem and leaves of the bellflower in the back of the movement, like in the bridges. So if you look at it and kind of stand back for a second, it looks like a bellflower. And they've done it all through where they obviously separated the bridges, but then the beveling is just phenomenal. Like it's so wide on this, and you have to see it to appreciate it because the pictures do not do it justice. You also have a power reserve on the back as well, the Credor logo, and the nomenclature of Seiko and the jewels and all those sorts of things. So really one of the finest watches out there, and I think it would be wrong to have a video like this and not include Credor as one of the watches on the list because they do it so well at this micro artist studio, and this is an example of a blue dial that is just spectacular, and the movement is absolutely beautiful. So those are 5 of the most beautifully finished watches in the industry. And of course there are more. I mean, there are other brands. There's, Moritz, Grossman, there's Romain, Gauthier. I mean, there's so many other independents and things like that where the finishing is spectacular. Gronefeld, I didn't mention them, but I do think that these 5 are probably going to be a little bit more well-known. I do think that they're probably going to be a little more available for the most part, than some of the independent brands where the watchmaking is very, very excellent, but probably a little bit more limited in terms of what's available. And again, we're talking about really high price points for a lot of these, so they may be inaccessible to some folks. I mean, they're inaccessible for me, except for maybe a Duometre, but that's just, again, that's part of the appreciation of what some of these brands have been able to do and the finishing that they've put into some of their watches. So definitely check them out if you've never gotten the chance to see some of these in person. So I want to say thanks for stopping by. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, definitely take a look at my most recent upload where we're talking all about perlage. I mentioned it a few times in the podcast today. And it's essentially one of the types of movement finishing that you'll find on many luxury watches. So if you enjoy this type of content, definitely check that video out. And I just appreciate you for stopping by. So please leave a comment down below. Let me know, what do you think is maybe the top, couple, or maybe your top in terms of movement finishing when it comes to watches? I would be curious to know. And until next time, be well, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.